Her pulse faded beneath his desperate hands. Samuel never imagined the dying child would change everything. The same determined eyes as her mother, the CEO he'd silently adored from afar. Single dad nurse revived a girl, then realized she was his CEO's daughter, became his impossible truth. Her small hand gripped his, pulling him from shadows into terrifying light. Samuel's hands moved with practiced precision across the small chest of the unconscious girl who had been rushed into the emergency room minutes earlier, her face pale as winter moonlight against the stark white of the hospital sheets. The chaotic symphony of urgent voices and beeping monitors faded to background noise as he focused entirely on the rhythm beneath his palms, encountering compressions with the determined concentration that had earned him a reputation as one of Boston Memorial's most reliable trauma nurses. Sweat beaded at his temples despite the perpetual chill of the emergency department, his scrubs already damp from the 12-hour shift that should have ended 30 minutes ago. But the familiar weight of responsibility kept his movements steady despite the exhaustion threatening to cloud his mind. The girl couldn't be more than 8 or 9, with honey-blonde hair splayed across the pillow like a halo, reminding him painfully of his own daughter waiting at home with the babysitter who was undoubtedly checking her watch and calculating overtime pay that Samuel could barely afford on a single income. "She's crashing again," called Dr. Patel from across the room, her voice cutting through Samuel's momentary distraction as the monitors erupted into a cacophony of alarms that signaled the girl's heart had once more fallen into a dangerous arrhythmia that threatened to steal her away completely. The controlled chaos of the trauma room intensified as Samuel stepped back to allow the doctor access with the defibrillator paddles, his eyes never leaving the child's face, noting the delicate arch of her eyebrows and the scattered freckles across her nose that stirred something familiar in his memory, though he couldn't place why. The jolt of electricity made the small body jump slightly on the table, and in that suspended moment between life and death, Samuel found himself making a silent, desperate plea to whatever forces might be listening, that this child would not become another loss, another family shattered by the random cruelty of circumstance that he had witnessed too many times in his 15 years of nursing. "We've got rhythm," announced the respiratory therapist with quiet triumph, the tension in the room immediately shifting as the monitor's erratic peaks stabilized into the more regular pattern that meant life had decided to remain rather than depart. Samuel released the breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders dropping slightly as the immediate crisis passed, though the girl remained unconscious, her condition still precariously balanced between recovery and decline. The trauma team moved with practiced efficiency around her, securing IV lines, adjusting medication drips, preparing for the additional tests that would hopefully reveal why a seemingly healthy child had collapsed without warning and been rushed to their emergency room by frantic bystanders who had found her in a coffee shop near the hospital. No identification had been found with her. No worried parent had yet appeared in the waiting room demanding information about their missing child. And something about this detail twisted uncomfortably in Samuel's chest as he adjusted the thermal blanket around her small form. Dr. Patel touched his shoulder lightly as she moved past him toward the door, her face showing the particular blend of concern and professional distance that all medical staff eventually developed as a necessary shield. "Good work, Samuel," she said quietly, glancing back at the still form on the bed. "The social worker's been called, and we'll get her admitted to pediatric ICU as soon as there's a bed available, but can you stay with her until then? Your connection with kids is better than anyone else on shift right now, and something tells me she's going to need that when she wakes up." The request wasn't unusual. Samuel had a natural way with pediatric patients that had become well known throughout the hospital, But tonight the words settled heavily on his already burdened shoulders as he calculated how much more the babysitter would charge, and whether his daughter Lily would already be asleep by the time he finally made it home. He nodded despite these concerns, pulling a rolling stool to the bedside and settling in for the vigil, his experienced eyes tracking the vital signs displayed on the monitor, while his mind wandered to the pile of unpaid bills on his kitchen counter and the parent-teacher conference he had missed yesterday because of another extended shift. The girl's breathing had steadied now, her chest rising and falling in the shallow pattern of deep unconsciousness, and Samuel allowed himself to really look at her face properly for the first time since she'd been brought in. The delicate chin, the slight furrow between her eyebrows that suggested she might be dreaming, the shape of her mouth that seemed to hold the ghost of a smile even in this state. The nagging sense of recognition returned stronger now, accompanied by an inexplicable tightness in his chest that went beyond his usual compassion for young patients. There was something about this child that felt important in a way he couldn't articulate, as though the universe had deliberately placed her under his care for reasons that extended beyond the random assignments of an emergency room. Hours passed in the quiet beeping of monitors and the hushed conversations of staff passing in the hallway outside, the emergency department gradually settling into the strange, liminal calm that sometimes descended in the early morning hours between the chaos of evening traumas and the steady influx of morning arrivals. Samuel had sent a text to his babysitter explaining the situation and received a terse reply that she would stay overnight for double her usual rate. Another financial strain he would somehow have to accommodate, but his attention remained fixed on the girl whose color had gradually improved from ghostly white to a healthier pink as the night progressed. It was just past 4 in the morning when her eyelids fluttered for the first time, a small hand twitching against the starched hospital sheet, and Samuel leaned forward, speaking in the gentle voice he used with his own daughter after nightmares. "Hey there, you're safe now, you're in the hospital, and I'm a nurse named Samuel who's been looking after you. Can you tell me your name?" The girl's eyelids fluttered again, revealing irises the color of amber caught in sunlight, momentarily unfocused before sharpening with the confusion of someone abruptly pulled from darkness into unfamiliar surroundings. Samuel maintained a careful distance, knowing from years of experience that the disorientation of waking in a hospital could easily tip into panic if not handled with gentle patience and clear explanation. The monitors continued their steady rhythm of beeps and digital readings as the child's consciousness gradually solidified, her gaze drifting around the room before settling on Samuel's face with unexpected intensity that seemed far too perceptive for her young years. A small furrow appeared between her eyebrows as she studied him, her lips parting slightly, as though testing whether they remembered how to form words after their ordeal, and Samuel found himself holding his breath as he waited for her to speak, unsure why his heart had begun to race with a strange anticipation that went beyond professional concern. "Emma," she finally whispered, the single word emerging hoarse and fragile into the space between them, carrying with it a spark of personality that transformed her from anonymous patient to specific, unique individual in an instant. Samuel smiled encouragingly, making a note of the name on the chart while maintaining the warm eye contact that helped establish trust with pediatric patients who found themselves suddenly vulnerable in the clinical environment of a hospital. Emma tried to sit up then, wincing as the movement pulled at the IV line secured to the back of her small hand, and Samuel reached forward instinctively to steady her with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to anticipating a patient's needs before they fully formed. "Easy there," he cautioned softly. "Your body's been through quite an ordeal and needs a little time to recover. Can you tell me your last name too, Emma, and maybe who we should call to let them know you're here with us?" "Winters," she replied after a moment of hesitation, her voice gaining strength as she settled back against the pillows, eyeing the medical equipment surrounding her bed with wary curiosity rather than fear. "My mum's name is Victoria Winters. She runs Horizon Technologies. Everyone knows her." The words were delivered with the particular blend of pride and matter-of-factness that children often used when describing parents they admired. But they hit Samuel with the force of a physical blow, causing him to fumble the pen he had been holding and nearly topple the cup of cold coffee that had been sitting untouched on the nearby table for several hours. Victoria Winters. The name echoed in his mind like a bell, triggering a cascade of memories and emotions that he struggled to contain behind his professional expression as he nodded and made another note on the chart with a hand that wasn't quite steady anymore. Samuel had seen Victoria Winters countless times over the past 3 years. Her sleek, confident figure moving through the upscale coffee shop near the hospital, where he sometimes treated himself to an expensive latte on particularly difficult days, watching from a distance as she conducted business meetings or worked intensely on her laptop, admiring the focused intelligence that radiated from her like a tangible force. He had constructed elaborate fantasies about accidentally bumping into her, spilling her coffee, and insisting on buying her another, starting a conversation that would reveal how much they had in common, despite their obviously different worlds. But he had never found the courage to breach the invisible barrier between them. Instead, he had contented himself with these brief, stolen glimpses into her life, collecting them like precious stones, the way she always tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, how she took her coffee with a single packet of sugar stirred precisely 12 times, the rare sound of her laughter when she occasionally met friends rather than colleagues. "Your mom," Samuel managed to say, his voice remarkably normal, considering the internal earthquake reshaping his reality. "We'll definitely contact her right away, Emma, though it's still very early in the morning, so it might take a little while to reach her." He pressed the call button for the nurses' station, needing someone else to take over the immediate task of contacting Victoria Winters, while he processed the staggering coincidence that had placed her daughter, this child whose life he had helped save, directly in his path. The universe had a strange sense of humor, Samuel thought distantly, or perhaps a sense of poetry that was currently lost on him as he struggled with the knowledge that his years of silent, distant admiration for Emma's mother now seemed uncomfortably close to something more problematic in light of this new connection. He had never intended harm or intrusion, had never followed Victoria or attempted to insert himself into her life. His interest had remained firmly in the realm of harmless daydream and wistful what-ifs. But he suddenly wondered how his behavior would appear if described objectively to someone else. Emma was watching him with that disconcertingly perceptive gaze again, her head tilted slightly as though trying to solve a puzzle presented by his expression. "You know my mom, don't you?" she asked suddenly, the question slicing through Samuel's internal turmoil with the innocent precision that children sometimes possessed, uncomplicated by adult pretense or social filtering. Before Samuel could formulate an appropriate response that neither lied to a child nor revealed the uncomfortable truth, the door opened to admit the night charge nurse who had answered his call, her appearance providing a welcome interruption and shift in focus. "Emma's last name is Winters," Samuel explained, standing up from the stool he had occupied for hours, his legs stiff and protesting the movement. "Her mother is Victoria Winters of Horizon Technologies. We need to contact her immediately and let her know Emma's here and stable." The charge nurse nodded, already pulling out her phone to begin the process, while Samuel turned back to Emma, finding professional refuge in explaining what would happen next, the additional tests to determine what had caused her collapse, the likely transfer to the pediatric floor once a bed was available, the importance of resting and allowing her body to recover from the trauma it had experienced. He spoke with the practiced calm that had comforted countless frightened children over the years. But his mind continued its parallel track of growing realization about the position he now found himself in, knowing that Victoria Winters would soon walk through the doors of this hospital, no longer a distant figure glimpsed through a coffee shop window, but a worried mother whose child had nearly died under his care. The weight of this impending collision between his private infatuation and professional reality settled heavily across his shoulders as he adjusted Emma's blanket, checked her IV line, and prepared to face the consequences of a fascination he had never intended to be revealed. The hospital corridors gradually awakened to the rhythms of the morning shift change, fluorescent lights humming with sterile consistency as night staff completed their final rounds and day personnel arrived with fresh energy and coffee-scented determination. Samuel remained at Emma's bedside despite the end of his extended shift, unable to bring himself to leave before Victoria arrived. Caught in a strange limbo between professional duty and personal dread that kept him vigilantly monitoring the girl's improving vital signs. Emma had drifted back to sleep after providing her mother's contact information, her body demanding rest to continue the healing process, which had given Samuel precious time to compose himself and contemplate the approaching moment when Victoria Winters would walk through the door and irrevocably connect his carefully separated worlds. The thought filled him with a nauseating mixture of anticipation and terror, his mind churning through possible scenarios and explanations that might minimize the uncomfortable truth of his silent admiration. Dawn light began to filter through the narrow horizontal window of the treatment room, painting subtle gold across the linoleum floor and softening the harsh institutional environment with its gentle presence. Samuel checked his phone to find 3 messages from his babysitter expressing increasing annoyance at his extended absence, and a single text from Lily with a row of heart emojis and a "miss you, daddy" that twisted his already knotted stomach with guilt. He had been away from home too often lately, working double shifts to cover mounting expenses and failing to be present for the ordinary moments that constituted his daughter's childhood. The homework questions, the bedtime stories, the small confidences shared in the quiet moments before sleep. Sacrifices made for financial survival that nonetheless extracted a price he was increasingly uncertain they could afford. The parallels between his situation and what Emma must be experiencing with a CEO mother whose demanding career likely consumed much of her time did not escape Samuel's notice, though he immediately felt uncharitable for making assumptions about Victoria's parenting based on his limited window into her life. A commotion in the hallway outside pulled Samuel from these thoughts, the sharp click of heels against tile growing rapidly louder and accompanied by an authoritative voice that cut through the typical hospital background noise with crystalline clarity. "I was told my daughter is in this department, Emma Winters. I need to see her immediately." "Did..." The voice was controlled but with an undercurrent of barely restrained panic that Samuel recognized from countless family members who had stood in that same hallway outside these same doors, their worlds suddenly reduced to the singular focus of reaching their loved one. He stood from the stool that had been his post for the night, smoothing his rumpled scrubs in a futile attempt at presentability, his heart hammering against his ribs with such force he wondered if it might be audible to others as the door swung open to reveal the woman whose face had occupied so many of his private thoughts, now transformed by fear and desperate hope into something both familiar and entirely new. Victoria Winters appeared in the doorway like an apparition made solid, her usual polished corporate armor visibly assembled in haste, a silk blouse partially untucked from tailored pants, one earring missing, hair pulled back in a hasty ponytail rather than her customary smooth chignon. Her eyes found Emma immediately, skipping over Samuel as though he were merely another piece of medical equipment, until she had confirmed with her own gaze that her daughter was indeed breathing, alive, present, Only then did she seem to register his existence, her attention shifting to him with the focused intensity he had observed from afar but never experienced directly. "Are you her doctor? What happened? Is she going to be all right?" The questions came in rapid succession, her voice tight with controlled emotion as she moved to Emma's side, one manicured hand reaching out to gently touch her daughter's cheek in a gesture so tender it made Samuel's chest ache with unexpected empathy for this woman he had believed he knew through observation, but was now seeing in an entirely different context. "I'm Samuel Thorne, one of the nurses who treated Emma when she was brought in," he replied, maintaining the professional demeanor that had carried him through countless similar conversations with frightened family members, though none had ever made his pulse race quite like this. "Dr. Patel is the attending physician, and she'll be able to give you complete details shortly. But Emma experienced a severe cardiac event, possibly related to an undiagnosed condition, and we were able to stabilize her. The preliminary tests suggest she's responding well to treatment, though we'll need to run more comprehensive diagnostics to determine the underlying cause." He delivered this information with practiced clarity despite the surreal quality of the moment, standing 3 feet away from a woman whose coffee order he could recite from memory, whose laughter he had catalogued like rare music, whose life had existed parallel to his own without intersection until this moment when their worlds had collided in the most unexpected and consequential way possible. Victoria's shoulders sagged slightly with visible relief at the positive prognosis, though the worry remained etched across her features as she pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, maintaining contact with Emma through a gentle hand on her arm. "She's never had any health problems," she said quietly, more to herself than to Samuel, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. "She's always been so strong, so energetic. I don't understand how this could happen without warning." The vulnerability in her voice struck Samuel with unexpected force, stripping away the idealized image he had constructed of Victoria Winters, CEO and untouchable object of admiration, revealing instead a mother terrified for her child, a human being experiencing the same fears and uncertainties that had kept him awake countless nights worrying about his own daughter's well-being in a world full of unpredictable dangers and heartbreaks that no parent could fully prevent. The recognition of this shared humanity, this common ground of parental love and terror, shifted something fundamental in Samuel's perception, transforming his years of distant fascination into something both more complex and more genuine in a single clarifying moment. "Children are remarkably resilient," he found himself saying, the words emerging from the place where his professional experience and personal understanding as a parent overlapped. And Emma demonstrated that resilience last night. She fought hard, and her body responded well to treatment. "Dr. Patel is excellent, one of our best, and she'll make sure Emma gets every test and consultation needed to understand what happened and prevent it from recurring." He hesitated before adding, "My own daughter had a health scare when she was younger, different circumstances, but I understand how it feels to be suddenly confronted with your child's vulnerability. It's overwhelming." The admission felt dangerous in its authenticity, a step beyond the carefully maintained professional boundaries he typically observed with patients' families, yet necessary in acknowledging the truth of their shared experience rather than hiding behind the comfortable distance of clinical language. Victoria looked up at him then, really seeing him for the first time, her gaze sharpening with focused attention that suggested she was accustomed to quickly assessing people and situations, cataloguing details most would miss. "You've been here all night with her," she stated rather than asked, noting his exhausted appearance and the empty coffee cups accumulated on the nearby counter. "Long after your shift ended, I imagine." There was a question beneath the observation, And Samuel recognized the dangerous threshold he now approached, the moment when explanation could too easily become confession, when professional dedication might reveal its complicated underpinnings in personal interest. Before he could formulate a response that balanced truth with appropriate discretion, Emma stirred beside them, amber eyes opening once more to find her mother's face hovering anxiously above her own. And the room was suddenly filled with the emotional reunion of parent and child that temporarily suspended the unasked questions hanging between the adults who had each, in their own way, been keeping watch through the long night. The fluorescent lights of the pediatric wing cast a muted glow on Samuel's exhausted figure as he entered the ward once again, 3 days after Emma's crisis. The antiseptic smell clung to his senses like a second skin, yet beneath it was the faint sweetness of flowers that marked room 412, Emma Winter's new home within the hospital. Though his shift had ended long ago, Samuel couldn't quiet the pull that drew him back. He told himself it was professional duty, a nurse's habit of following up on difficult cases, but the unease in his chest betrayed a deeper truth. Each visit tested the thin, ethical line between compassion and personal involvement, and 3 sleepless nights had done nothing to silence his conscience. Inside the room, the contrast between suffering and privilege struck him with quiet force. Emma sat propped up on crisp white pillows, her small hands busy with a tablet, while her mother, Victoria, worked from a sleek laptop beside her. The soft murmur of their devices filled the space, a digital lullaby in an otherwise sterile setting. The mother's vigilance never wavered, one eye on spreadsheets, one always on her child. Samuel lingered in the doorway before knocking softly, as if to ask permission not just to enter the room, but to cross into the fragile harmony of their world. Emma's joy at recognizing him was instant, her amber eyes shining with unguarded affection. She thanked him for saving her life, her voice pure and unfiltered in its gratitude. Samuel's heart clenched. The child's innocence illuminated everything he wished to ignore about his motives, the admiration he had long harbored for the woman sitting beside her. Victoria's gaze sharpened at the mention of his late-night vigil, curiosity and assessment flickering behind her composed expression. When she spoke of the arrhythmia that had nearly taken her daughter's life, the tremor beneath her calm tone carried the echo of unspoken fear. For a while, their exchange remained safely within the bounds of medicine and procedure, recovery plans, prescriptions, follow-up care. But when Emma's curiosity turned the conversation personal, asking about Samuel's daughter, something shifted. It was as if the sterile air of the hospital room dissolved into something warmer. They spoke, cautiously at first, of parenthood, of exhaustion, sacrifice, and the quiet guilt of never being enough. Samuel saw, beneath Victoria's polished composure, a mother stretched thin between ambition and love, mirroring his own endless balancing act between work and fatherhood. Victoria's confession that she feared losing her daughter's childhood to her success struck him deeply. It was the kind of truth few allowed themselves to say aloud. In her vulnerability, Samuel recognized the mirror of his own failings, the same quiet self-blame that haunted every parent trying to do right with limited means. The walls between their worlds thinned, revealing shared humanity beneath the contrast of privilege and fatigue. The sound of their laughter, trading stories of messy breakfasts and failed science experiments, softened the hard edges of hospital life into something unexpectedly intimate. By the time the sun began to fade behind the hospital windows, their conversation had slipped into an easy rhythm, 2 parents briefly forgetting their burdens in each other's understanding. Samuel knew he should leave, that Lily would be waiting to be picked up, but just as he reached the door, Victoria's voice caught him mid-step. Her question, "Have we met before?" froze him. It was not just curiosity, but instinct, the faint memory of recognition she couldn't yet place. And in that instant, Samuel realized the time for evasion had ended. Later, the corridor outside Emma's room became a kind of crossroads. Victoria's question echoed in his head, demanding honesty he had long delayed. The truth was both simple and heavy. He had seen her many times before, at a cafe called Westside Brew. She had been a part of his quiet mornings and weary evenings, unknowingly woven into the rhythm of his solitude. His confession came haltingly, the words fragile in the sterile light. He told her how he had noticed her, not as an object, but as a presence, a stranger whose grace and kindness had drawn his tired eyes during moments of stillness. Victoria listened without interruption, but her silence was sharp, her composure masking the storm beneath. When she finally spoke, her words landed with surgical precision. To her ears, his actions sounded like intrusion, even obsession. Samuel felt each syllable like a cut, realizing how easily innocence could resemble intent when seen from another angle. He tried to explain that he had never followed, never pried, only noticed, but the explanation trembled on the edge of futility. Still, he continued, because stopping now would make the truth meaningless. When she asked what he had felt upon discovering that Emma was her daughter, his answer came without defense: terror. Terror of losing the child in his care, and terror of what his past silence would mean if she ever learned the truth. Guilt had followed immediately, and then resolve, the kind that leaves no room for self-preservation. All that mattered then was saving Emma. And in that raw confession, Victoria saw something she could recognize, not deceit, but devotion misdirected by loneliness. Her next question pierced deeper. Why had he continued visiting after Emma's stabilization? Samuel paused, then told her the truth in its simplest form, because he needed to know that the story had an ending. In 15 years of nursing, patients came and went, their recoveries unknown. But this time something compelled him to stay, to witness not just survival, but healing. And perhaps, if he was honest, to see if the woman who had unknowingly accompanied his quiet mornings was more than the image he'd built in solitude. The air between them grew heavy with honesty, uncomfortable, naked, but real. Victoria looked at him for a long time, her features softening from judgment to something quieter. At last, she exhaled and gestured toward the empty chair beside her. Her voice, when it came, carried both weariness and grace. She suggested they begin again, not as a nurse and a patient's mother, nor as the observer and the observed, but simply as two people who had crossed paths through an accident of fate. The rest, she said, could unfold naturally if they allowed it. Samuel sat down, his heartbeat unsteady in the stillness. For the first time in years, he felt no need to defend or hide. Through the window, the city pulsed with distant life, its lights shimmering against the glass like a reflection of something reborn. Emma's soft breathing filled the silence, her presence anchoring the fragile peace between them. The moment carried the sense of something beginning, tentative but true. When Victoria extended her hand, the gesture was both formal and deeply human. Her touch dispelled the ghosts of misunderstanding, grounding them in the present rather than the past. Samuel took her hand, the contact quiet but profound, like a vow neither had expected to make. In that touch lived forgiveness and perhaps the first spark of trust. Outside, the night thickened, indifferent to what unfolded inside room 412. Yet for Samuel, the world felt subtly altered. The boundaries that had once confined him between duty and desire, guilt and grace, had blurred into something softer, something that resembled hope. For Victoria, too, the evening carried a sense of release, not just from fear, but from the isolation of strength maintained too long. As the machines hummed gently beside Emma's bed, Samuel and Victoria sat in silence, not needing words to acknowledge what had changed. Their meeting had begun in crisis, marked by mistakes and confession. But beneath it all lay a quiet understanding that connection, even when born from error, can heal. In the days that followed, Samuel continued his work at the hospital, but his visits to room 412 became less about guilt and more about presence. Emma's laughter grew stronger, echoing in the corridors like a promise. And though Samuel and Victoria still spoke carefully, their words carried the cautious ease of two people no longer hiding behind professional masks. Months later, when Emma was discharged, she ran to hug Samuel before leaving, her small arms wrapping around him with a child's unfiltered affection. "See you at the coffee shop," she whispered, and Victoria smiled, a real smile this time, warm and unguarded. Samuel nodded, the words catching in his throat. And so the story closed, not with a grand declaration, but with quiet grace. A man forgiven for his mistakes, a woman willing to see beyond them, and a child whose survival had turned strangers into something more. Beneath the harsh lights of the hospital, where life and death so often crossed, something fragile yet enduring had begun to grow. Not perfection, but possibility.